Hello, and welcome to my next nap. And I'm your Irina Oshkova, your nonprofit auditor. NAP stands for Nonprofit Auditor Points, and I designed NAPs to help nonprofit community, and specifically its finance, accounting, and governance departments to understand accrual accounting, understand general accepted accounting principles around nonprofits, hopefully to make it easier for nonprofits to understand and read the financial statements. Let's continue our discussion about net assets with donor restrictions. In a previous video, I discussed net assets without donor restrictions, and we said that even though the net assets without donor restriction can have various net assets inside. They can be board designated net assets, which are less formal, and it can be quasi endowment fund created by board, which is more formal. However, regardless the names that we create within net assets without the donor restrictions, true restrictions can only come from donor. Therefore, much more restricted funds are net assets with donor restrictions. Again, these funds have to be restricted by a donor. They cannot be, once they're restricted by the donor, they cannot be unrestricted by the governance, meaning by board or by management, and it would be illegal for nonprofit to use these funds for anything else but how it was donated to the organization. So donor can donate funds with the restriction. One caveat. Lately, it's very popular for donors to donate funds through donor-advised funds. It's important to know that any restriction that donor puts on a donation through donor-advised funds, that restriction does not flow to nonprofit, because nonprofit will receive funds through donor-advised fund. So the true donor for nonprofit, it will be donor-advised fund. Therefore, it's a caution for a donor. If the donor would like to have funds restricted, they have to donate directly to a nonprofit, not through donor advised fund. So when the nonprofit receive funds from a donor that restricted, what does it mean? Donor can restrict funds in two ways: by a purpose or by time. The purpose restriction would be the donor can restrict funds to be spent for something that is much more narrower than overall mission of the organization. For example, if nonprofit mission is to help reading in elementary schools, grades kindergarten through 6, provide various reading programs. If a donor donate funds saying this is for the reading programs for kindergartners only, that it's much more narrower than overall mission of the organization, and it will be restricted for the services specifically provided to kindergartners. Also, donor can restrict funds by time. Time can be, donor can give money that needs to be spent within the next 3 years. So it's restricted for the period of 3 years. These are called temporary restrictions, because eventually they will be met and the funds will be used. So restricted by purpose or restricted by time. Another type of restriction, it's called permanent in nature, and that's when the donor donates funds that needs to be restricted in perpetuity, meaning they have to stay restricted, meaning nonprofit cannot spend the corpus of the funds It's also called endowment fund. So true endowment fund can come only from a donor. If the donor donates permanently restricted funds, the donor creates endowment. Why would nonprofit accept permanently restricted funds? Typically, because even though corpus or principal amount that the donor donates is restricted in perpetuity, meaning forever and cannot be spent, the earnings that this fund can generate typically can be used for whatever specific purpose donor will identify. For example, donor can give $10 million to be restricted in perpetuity and indicate that earnings, meaning dividends, interest, realized gains, can be spent for running reading programs in elementary schools. So earnings will be restricted by purpose, but principal or corpus of the funds that were donated are going to be restricted in perpetuity forever. So these type of endowments are formally created. A nonprofit board of directors needs to develop endowment funds policy, specifically indicating how nonprofit going to preserve the corpus, that funds where they're going to be invested, how the earnings will be spent. All this information should be presented on financial statements, in the footnotes financial statements. These funds need to be reported separately, tracked separately, because nonprofit needs to be accountable for the funds that they accepted from the donor and need to adhere to wishes that donor specifically indicated in its donation. As I mentioned before, for nonprofits, it's absolutely impairment not to spend these funds in any other way but how donor wished. To conclude, net assets are similar as equity in for-profit companies. However, net assets have various type of net assets inside overall bucket of net assets. And net assets, it's everything that nonprofit accumulated from inception up until the point of time we're looking, typically end of the year, all the assets that are available for the organization to use. And to have a sustainable nonprofit, it's typically advisable to have 6 to 9 months of that net assets reserve that organization can use. However, it's important not only to look at net assets, but very critical to understand the structure of net assets. What type of net assets included in the overall net assets? As we indicated, unrestricted or net assets without a donor restriction is the best type for nonprofits, because nonprofit can use it for any purposes as long as it's inside in overall mission of the organization. Net assets with donor restrictions do require very close attention and reporting. Restriction can be temporarily in nature, meaning that nonprofit will eventually spend money in accordance with either time restriction or purpose restriction, or some funds can be restricted in perpetuity forever, and they create endowment fund which will be restricted forever, and only earnings of the fund can be spent for specific purpose that donor indicated. Based on our experience, nonprofits do have outside systems. Very often it's Excel, where they do track all their restricted funds, the releases of restricted funds separately, to make sure that they account for them in detail and present them properly on financial statements. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here with me, and I hope to see you for the next nap. Talk to you soon. Bye.